Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So my name is Ola Wikander, and I'm by trade actually not an Indo-Europeanist, but a Semitist, an Old Testament scholar, to be precise. But for many years, I've been interested in Indo-European stuff as well, and that has led me to sort of some crossover work, and that's why I'm here today. And it's actually quite funny that I'm doing this quote unquote in Cambridge today, because tomorrow I'll actually be going to Cambridge for a visiting fellowship. So I'll see that as this as a sort of pre-show, I guess. So the title of my talk is "The Sound of Serpents and Serpent-Slayers in Indo-European and Northwest Semitic," and you hear all the S's there. The sounds of serpents and serpent-slayers, and there's a point to that, and you'll see why the title is like that. So yeah, what I'll be talking about is early poetic calquing from Indo-European to Semitic being used as an indicator for elucidating phonological details of the loan giver. So methodologically, what I'll be talking about here is a sort of confluence between poetic phrasal reconstruction of the Calvert-Watkins sort, very much his sort actually, as you'll see, the study of borrowings, and also the study of what Gilad Zuckerman referred to as phonosemantic matching, which is the process by which loans and calques sometimes try to use phonological material that is similar to the phonological structure of the loan giver in order to create a similar effect. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. Right. Let's start out with this. This is a very famous phrase, of course, egwent oguim. He killed the serpent. Going back to Calvert-Watkins's famous reconstruction of a serpent-slaying phrase of Proto-Indo-European in more modern laryngealist terms, you'd probably call it rather egwent oguim, with also, however that would have been pronounced, with a laryngeal number 3. This is a famous phrase indeed, and of course attested all over the Indo-European, large swaths of the Indo-European area. But Indo-European is not the only language family that possesses stories about serpent battling heroes and storm deities killing them, killing the said serpents. In fact, there are a number of such stories in Semitic, quite a number of them. And most famously, we have stories about Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible and Baal. And one of the most famous ones is what I have on screen right now. Most famously, it's Isaiah 27, verse 1, which says of Yahweh, Bayom hahu yifqod Adonai b'harbo ha'qasha wa'hagedola wa'hazaqa al-livyatan nahash bariyah wa'al-livyatan nahash aqalathon wa'haraghet ha'tanin asher bayam. On that day, Yahweh will punish with his heavy, great, and strong sword the Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Yes, the Leviathan, the writhing serpent. He will kill the dragon in the sea. So there we have a famous phrase showing a Semitic storm god destroying a great serpent, chaos serpent or dragon. This quotation famously has a direct parallel in Ugaritic, which you can see on screen now, where it's Baal, the Ugaritic storm god, who smote Litan, which is just a different form of the Leviathan name, the fleeing serpent, killed off the writhing serpent, the ruler with the 7 heads. And so there's exactly the same phraseology, and we can actually see that this must be an inherited poetic phrase and not just, you know, coincidence, because it includes this phrase, the writhing serpent, writhing, which in Ugaritic is akalatanu in line 2, and in Hebrew is akalaton. And we also have the phrase, the fleeing serpent. The serpent is bariyah, and these are almost hapax legomena within these corpora. So it shows that this is a commonly descended poetic phrase, very similar, in fact, to the famous egwent or gwim of Indo-European. And there are numerous instances of this storm god killing serpent mytheme in the Hebrew Bible. Some of them are more or less buried beneath a philological morass of textual alterations, etc. Yeah, I have some of them up on the screen here, but there are numerous instances of it, both inside and outside the Hebrew Bible. These instances vary somewhat in terminology. The snake in question, the chaos snake, it can be referred to by name, Leviathan, Litan. It could be Bathanu, where Bathanu or Bathanum, which probably just meant serpent. That we saw that in the Ugaritic example, where the Litan or the Leviathan was a Bathanu. But there are probably also some cases in Hebrew where it turned up as Bashan by regular sound law, which is normally a word for a geographical place, but in some cases it appears to actually refer to the chaos serpent. Or the snake can be Nahashu. That's Nahash in Hebrew and Nahashu in Ugaritic. We found that in the Isaiah passage, for example, and it also appears once in one Ugaritic text. The verb for the killing, in which the storm god kills the monster, that varies, but it's quite common that the verb used is the one we saw here in Ugaritic, which is the first verb, which is the verb machatza, which means to smite or strike. That's the one you see in the first line there, the root which means strike or kill. I give two forms of it there, and you'll soon see why. It's because there were probably two proto-roots there that got conflated. Stay with me for this Semitic stuff. We'll get back to the Indo-European soon enough. Here are some other examples from the Hebrew Bible. First, we had Deuteronomy 33, verse 11, which in the standard text version has, he smite the loins of his adversaries and his enemies so they cannot rise up. But there's a grammatical weirdness there, which is solved if we just switch a couple of letters out and presuppose a textual corruption from Taninim, dragons. Mahatz Taninim Kamav Umetzanav Min Yakumun. Smite the dragons, his adversaries and his enemies, so they cannot rise up. And we have Job 26, where we again have in the second line there, Uvitvunato Mahatz Rahav. That's the same verb again. In his wisdom, he slew Rahab, which is another name of the serpent. And in the last one there from Psalm 68, we actually do have Bashan, the serpent word Bashan. But again, the verb used is Mahatz. Ach Elohim yimhatz rosh oyevav. Yes, God strikes the heads of his enemies. The Lord said, from Bashan, that is probably the serpent, I will bring them back. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. So what we see in all these cases, as well as in the Ugaritic one, is a big sea serpent whom a storm god kills, and this killing is quite often carried out with the verb mahatz, to strike or to kill. Also in the Job passage in the middle of the screen there, you actually see again the same phrase, Nahash Bariyah, the fleeing serpent, showing the commonality of the motival descent. Okay, so we have this idea both in Semitic and in Indo-European, this serpent-slaying myth theme. The question then is, was this perhaps borrowed from Indo-European? Or did it come the other way? Note that the famous Indo-European phrase has an inherent euphonic structure to it, egoent or guim, or egoent or guim, and it's attested over large swaths of the Indo-European linguistic area. This was, of course, Calvert-Watkins's basic point, which suggests that if there is a connection between the Indo-European and Semitic mythemes, Indo-European was the primary one. Okay, so if so, what could the lone giver here, the early lone giver, have been? Given the geography, some form of pre-Anatolian might be possible. And of course, we have the serpent-slaying phrase in Hittite, in Iluyangan Gwenta, which at least, Gwenta is at least the Gwent, killed, and according to some scholars, Iluyangan actually involves a relative of Ogwi, but that's debatable. The problem then, of course, perhaps would be that Anatolian is not normally thought to have had the augment, which really helps the old euphonic phrase, egwent or gwim, especially if we reconstruct it with a laryngeal at the start of the second word, which creates a nice euphony, egwent or gwim. But again, I want to point, as did the previous speaker, to the new dissertation of Stefan Norbrace, which has, in which it's argued quite persuasively, I think, that there may actually have been an augment in Anatolian early on. So Anatolian is a possible source for this borrowing. So what I will do now is not just note these parallels, but ask myself, what can this say? What could this say about the phonology of the actual loan giver itself? So we're going to try to go back to Indo-European through the possible loan into early Semitic and ask ourselves if we can learn something about the phonology of the loan giver. So to do that, we first have to ask ourselves if all these Semitic phrases go back to some sort of common phrase, common early Semitic phrase, similar to what Watkins said, the various Indo-European Ahan, Nahim, and Iluyank and Quenta, and all of them did. If that is the case, and that was originally calqued from an Indo-European source, what might that early Semitic phrase have looked like? That's the question. Can one reconstruct a Semitic phrase based on the attested material that A, has a similar sort of euphonic structure to the putative Indo-European Vorlage, that is sort of recreating its sound, so to speak, and B, a phrase that then could have generated the attested textual entities? And my answer to that is yes, and it was already back in 2017 when I proposed this phrase. I proposed it a little differently then, but this was the main gist of it, that there was an early Semitic phrase, machatza nahasham. It is a fact that he killed the serpent. Machatza is the verb, he struck, he killed, and nahasham is the accusative of nahashu, which we saw on an earlier screen as was one of the early words for the snake. And the reason I reconstructed the phrase like this, it was A, of course, that these words occur in the attested material, and B, that it fits the putative loan giver very well. Note the repeating gutturals and the sort of nasal, guttural, sibilant-ish structure of the phrase, mahatza nahasam, which would fit very well with an attempt to recreate the phonetic structure of an Indo-European version of egwent or gwim. What we would have there, in fact, is a sort of phonosemantic matching, i.e. an attempt in the borrowing language to recreate the sound, not only the meaning, but the sound of a borrowed phrase. So that's what I posited there. This would probably have been borrowed either in Proto-Northwest Semitic or even Proto-Central Semitic for morphosyntactic reasons, but also because this nahash apparently originally just meant beast, because we know from Akkadian East Semitic that there it didn't mean serpent but lion. So this borrowing would have to have taken place after the split between West and East Semitic, at least, and probably in Proto-Central Semitic times. Though one can note with some interest that there is one reference in Gilgamesh to an evil snake as a Neshu, that is a Nahash of the earth, a lion of the earth. So it could theoretically be older, but I think Central Semitic is the age for this. I know time is running short, but as I missed a minute or two, I hope I can go on for a little more. So when I first reconstructed this phrase back in 2017, I went with this, what you have on screen here, machatza nahasha, with an adjective sibilant or affricate in the first word, machatza. However, it can be shown using data from Arabic and Aramaic and other Semitic languages that the ts was probably originally not a ts, but an adjective lateral affricate, the very rare phoneme k. That's what's transcribed in Semitist circles as an S with an acute and a dot. There were probably two original roots here that were conflated, one with and one with you can see this probably from a cognate in Egyptian, so it could be from Proto-Afroasiatic date, but the immediate ancestor of the phrase would have had an S with an accent and a dot. That is an ejective lateral affricate. A very complex sound indeed. Machak'a nahasham. And the question then is, what would this imply if this was indeed the case? That was a very highly marked and unstable phoneme in Semitic languages, perhaps the most marked and unstable one. It's very rarely preserved and it's quite uncommon. It has a complex mode of articulation. It's ejective, lateral, and affricated at the same time, and so tended to merge into other sounds. But then again, let's look at what the putative loan giver, egwent ogwim, included. Not only would it have included a sort of rhyming euphonic sequence of labialized sounds, the gwis, especially interesting if there's a laryngeal 3 there, which may have been, in fact, have been labialized itself, and a lot of, back sounds. But it also included a specific, perhaps uncommon and unstable phoneme, that is the gw. The uncommonness is at least argued by Watkins in his original reconstruction, that this was a specific poetic flourish to use this gw, as he thought, uncommon gw twice in the word, that this was a special poetic point of the original word, original phrase. Compare this with the of the reconstructed Semitic phrase. What could this mean? Not only could the fact that there probably was an ejective lateral affricate in the Semitic phrase make the reconstruction even more probable, and thus serve as a sort of control for it almost, because it fits even better with the fact that the putative Indo-European loan giver had a complex and uncommon, perhaps uncommon sound to it. But it also may give us some hints as to how that gw sound may have been pronounced in early Indo-European itself. The Semitic phrase, or the Semitic sound, has a complex articulation. It is rare and it's highly marked. This, by implication, raises the possibility that the same would have been true for the Indo-European sound of the loan-giving phrase, as the Semitic borrower would have tried to calque or phonosemantically match the original phrase in order better to match its euphonic effect. So the fact that I've changed my mind from a t to a k actually both serves as a sort of, well, almost a sort of confirmation, or at least probability raiser, that the reconstruction of the Semitic phrase is correct, because it matches the structure of the Indo-European phrase, but it may also say something about what the gw was like. I will argue that this reconstruction, the machat and nahasham, raises the possibility of the gw in the original Indo-European phrase was a breathy voiced, highly marked and complex phoneme, as opposed to reconstructions that question the breathiness of the phoneme. To a Semitic listener, a breathy voiced and co-articulated consonant would have sounded quite strange. There are no breathy voiced consonants in early Semitic at all. There are voiced consonants, there are ejective consonants, but there are not, that is glottalized consonants, but there are no breathy voiced consonants. So to a Semitic listener, a breathy voiced and co-articulated complex consonant would have sounded strange and poetically powerful indeed, as well as it may to a modern speaker of English. Egwent or goim. It would have been very tempting indeed for that Semitic speaker to match that gw sound, the repeating gw sounds, to the rarest and most marked and co-articulated sound that he or she could produce in their own language, the k, creating machak'a nahasha. So just as the Semitic phoneme used to match the Indo-European one had a special phonation type, ejectivity, and a co-articulation, affricated lateral fricative, something similar would have been the case for the Proto-Indo-European phoneme. It's easier to explain the borrowing if it indeed was both breathy and labialized. So in a way, this Semitic reconstruction of a borrowing from an Indo-European poetic phrase supports the idea that yes, there was breathy voice here in the gw. It was regwent or egwent or goim, because that better creates an impetus for the Semitic borrower to create machatla nahasha.
Sorry, you have around 2 minutes left.
Thank you. So the Semitic borrower seems to have matched a co-articulate, breathy sound, which would have sounded very strange and, dare I say, dramatic to them, with the most co-articulated and marked sound of their own language, which, together with a preponderance of back fricatives in the Semitic phrase, machatla nahasha, as a correlate perhaps of the labialized velars, and perhaps even uvular if we have the interpret the laryngeal 3 like that of the Proto-European one, and the nasals machatla nahasham, which, you know, that in a way creates a sort of rhyme in the similar way to what egwent or goim does, as well as the general rhyming structure of both phrases. That supports the idea that yes, this Semitic phrase was calqued from the Indo-European one. Yes, the sounds were made to match up, and this poetic lone reconstruction, he killed or he struck the serpent, which both phrases mean, thus provides indirect support for the breathy voice as the probable phonation type of at least the gur of early Indo-European. Methodologically, this sort of work shows the possibility of combining the study of poetic phrasal reconstruction, as in egwent rogum itself and machatla nahasha, the study of borrowing from one language family to another, and the study of phonosemantic matching in the tradition of Gilad Zuckerman, and thence drawing possible conclusions about historical phonology, which I think is pretty cool, because it's 3 normally quite separate fields of study. So that's why I chose in my title the sound of serpents and serpent-slayers, because that in a way has a similar effect to machatla nahasham and egwent rogoim. And so, yeah, I thank you for attention and your attention, and thanks to my friend Alyosha Shorgo, who is also here today, for comments and suggestions. Some of the present results will be published soon in the article you see here, and the earlier stuff was in my book Unburning Fame from 2017. And here we have some bibliography for the whole thing, both from the Semitic and Indo-European ambit. And here's some data on the presentation background. And so I thank you for your attention, and please beware of the snakes. Thank you.